at a brief overview of the Impressionists. This is by no means complete, but it will at least get us in the wheelhouse and get us started. So who were the Impressionists? These are the people that are generally considered the Impressionists: Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Pierre Renoir, Mary Cassatt, Emile Pissarro, and Berthe Morisot. Claude Monet was born on November 14th, 1840 in Paris. He was the leader of a group of French artists that are today known as the Impressionists, which include the painters that we had just talked about. Monet's family moved to the port town of Le Havre in 1845. He took his early art lessons from a painter by the name of Eugène Bodin. Bodin, who worked up sketches out of doors, encouraged Monet to do the same. So this idea of what we call plein air, and it's a term for painting outside. Suddenly the veil was torn away. Monet says, "My destiny as a painter opened up to me." He later said for the next 60-plus years, Monet explored the effects of light on outdoor scenes. He was the first artist to let his initial impressions stand as a completed work rather than as notes done in preparation for a work for the studio. And this is one of the reasons why Impressionists were rejected, because people said, they're not complete, they're just sketches. But he said they were complete. So he moves to Paris in 1859, where he meets and befriends Pissarro and another sort of the grandfather of Impressionism, Edouard Manet. Not Monet, but Manet. He married in 1870 and in 1871 settled in Argenteuil. He fixed up a boat with an easel and painted his way up and down the Seine River, capturing his impressions of the interplay of light, water, and atmosphere. In 1874, Monet and a group of painters, including Pissarro and Renoir, banded together to form a society. They gave a public exhibition of their work at a studio of a Paris photographer. Monet exhibited a painting called Impression Sunrise. His painting gave the group its name. It was coined in a derisive comment by a critic by the name of Louis Leroy. He referred to the entire exhibition as impressionistic. Despite the financial failure of this first exhibition, the Impressionists continued to exhibit together until 1886. Monet slowly achieved recognition in the years after the Impressionists had disbanded. In 1883, he settled in Giverny, France, and continued to paint and explore his fascination with light until his death on December 5th in 1926. So let's take a look. Here is the Boulevard des Capucines, and it's an expression of sort of the rebuilding of Paris in 1873. And of course, it's alive with people and crowds, and everyone's kind of walking, and it's just really quite beautiful. In 1870, he marries and settles, like we said, in Argenteuil. He sets up his easel and he goes out on a boat. And let's take a look. So here we have the painting that kind of gave the Impressionists their name. And if we look at this painting, I think if we look at modern paintings today and we look at modernism in general, and we didn't have those two figures of the boat in there, this almost might be considered an abstract painting. But we can see like the shadow of the horizon line of the different features that are there, and other maybe boats and other things. And then we have the lone fisherman, you know, kind of coming across here on this boat. Really quite beautiful. And there's just another. This is a painting from a series of 64 paintings that he did regarding light, and they were the haystack paintings. I've actually seen these paintings. They were on exhibit in Chicago at the Chicago Art Institute, and it was an incredible show. So these were painted at different times of the day, different times of the year, so that, you know, that you could see that the same haystack might look completely different depending on if it was summer or spring or fall or winter, if it was early morning, sunrise, if it was high noon, or if it was kind of the sunset, like in this piece. And there, I'm just going to kind of go through some of the, and look at the thickness of the stroke, you know, the quickness of which they're laid down. Because why? Because the sun is changing and moving. And so you've got to be fast in order to paint this stuff. It's like you have to be quick. Now, remember that we have photography now. And so these artists are looking for different ways to express themselves. And one of the things that they're talking about is not just, you know, they're not just talking about painting for painting's sake, to recreate like an image, to be an exacting image, but they're talking about fleeting moments of light. So when we think about Impressionists, we really want to think about two things. We want to think about color theory, and that light is, Einstein says, you know, light is not stable, right? Light is constantly changing. And when it changes, the refractions of color that happen as the light is changing, changes also. And so that's what the Impressionists is really quite scientific, if we think about it. And so that's what the Impressionists were going for. Here's one in the winter. So the primary subjects of all of these paintings are a series of haystacks, and they were in the field after the harvest season. The title refers primarily to all the canvas series. He painted these in 1890. Some of the broader definitions of the title refer to other paintings by Monet that have the same theme. And again, it's about seasons, it's about weather, if it was raining, if it was bright, and so on. So here's like one of the winter scenes. Now here's another one, again, just totally different. Let's take a look at Water Lilies. So the Water Lilies is a series of approximately 250 oil paintings by Monet that he paints between 1840 and 1820 and 1926. I'm sorry, that he paints after he moves to Giverny. That's wrong. So that, you know, those dates are not accurate. The painting depicts Monet's flower garden at Giverny, and it's the main focus of Monet's artistic production during the last 30 years is his flower garden. So many of the works here are painted after Monet had suffered from cataracts. And of course, at that time, we didn't have a way to remove cataracts. During the 1920s, the state of France built a pair of oval rooms at the Musée de l'Oranger as a permanent home for 8 water lily murals by Monet. The exhibit opened to the public on the 16th of May in 1927, a few months after Monet's death. 60 water lily paintings from around the world were assembled for a special exhibition in 1999. And in 2007, one of Monet's water lily paintings sold for $18.5 million at Sotheby's. In 2008, another one of his water lily paintings, Le Bassin, aux Nymphes, sold for $41 million at Christie's in London, and so that was double the estimate of 24, almost double the estimate of 18 to 24 million. So you know, these paintings are highly sought after, and we can see how they're so quickly and roughly done. So let's take a look at Auguste Pierre Renoir. Renoir was a French painter originally associated with the Impressionist movement. His early works were typically Impressionist, what we call snapshots of real life, full of sparkle and color and light. By the mid-1880s, however, he had broken with the movement to apply a more disciplined, formal technique to portraits and figure paintings, particularly of women. One of them would be The Bathers in 1884. He does a series of that from 1884 to 1887. In 1854, he begins his work as a painter in a porcelain factory in Paris. He gains experience with light and fresh colors that were to distinguish his Impressionist work later on. And also, he learned a lot about craftsmanship because the porcelain had to be done exactly in a certain way. So let's take a look at some of his work. So here we have In the Meadow. His predilection towards light-hearted themes, also influenced by the great Rococo masters, whose works he studied in the Louvre. In 1862, he entered the studio of Glayer, and there he formed a lasting friendship with Monet and Cicely. And here we have, you know, the two young women. They're not looking at us. They're looking away from us. Everything is very softly created, just really beautiful. He also loved to paint, scenes. Again, everything was outside, so they were like quick. He painted them in the Barbizon district. Here's a painting of a cafe, and people are out on the boat. Here's another kind of better look at the same cafe, and then here they are out on kind of a landing. But look at the water, the quick brush strokes, the shadows of the trees, and just the way that he's defining these images. So unlike people who draw, for the most part, these paintings are shape. Think of them as, thick shapes of paint. Here's another of Renoir, Danius, 1874. There we see something much more refined, the facial expression. And then where is she? Where's the background? We don't know. We don't care. We're really just focused on the figure itself. Like Monet, Renoir endured much hardship during his early career, but he began to achieve success as a portrait painter in the 1870s, and that freed him from financial worries. And the reason why was because there was a dealer by the name of Paul Durand-Ruel who started to buy his work regularly by the early 1880s. Here's another one of his works. I just love, Dance at Bougival. I mean, so there he kind of zooms in, and we have the, happy expression. We don't really see the man, we see the woman. Beautiful. And the trees, all the quick strokes. Everything is just done very quickly. Here's another Dance in the Country. And we'll just take a look at some of his work. And don't forget Courbet, right? So you can see the influence of Courbet on these paintings. Here's an unfinished study for his painting, The Bather. And then here's the painting. Just look at the background, the painting of the trees. Look at the strokes of how the trees are built, and the strokes of like what's happening in the foreground. And 1, 2, 3 quick strokes, and we've got a glass of wine, or a decanter, a bottle of wine. The strokes on the face. I mean, everything is done. The little flower buds. There's no real intense definition. It's just they're there. So let's put them down. Look at the rowers in the background. And then that's so very quick, got to get the light, all the shadows that are kind of falling down as they're under this canopy of trees. And then here we are again, much more detailed. We get into the 1890s, right? So there we can see all the details in the hair and the clothing and the vase and, the hats, the flowers. It's really different. All right, let's move on to Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro was also a French Impressionist who had, again, quite a bit of financial hardship. And he also had eye trouble in later years. And even though he was really quite prolific as a painter, the Parisian and provincial scenes of this period include Place du Théâtre Français and the bridge at Bruges and others. And so let's take a look. So here's one of his works. Now you can see how these Impressionists really worked and looked at each other's work and were influenced by each other's work. Here's a great, if we look at the Théâtre Français from 1898, and I am going to just move on. It looks to the French artist Degas. So Degas was the son of a wealthy banker, and his aristocratic family background instilled in him early art as a kind of haughty yet sensitive quality of detachment. So he grew up, his idol was the painter Ingres, whose example pointed him in the direction of classical draftsmanship, stressing balance and clarity of outline. After beginning his artistic studies with Louis Lamothe, a pupil of Ingres, he started classes at the École des Beaux-Arts, but he left in 1854 and then went to Italy and eventually befriends Monet and the others. So you can see this is just a different way of painting. He's really influenced also by Edouard Manet. If we looked at Manet's paintings, you would definitely see an influence here. But one of the things that I think is interesting here about like this particular piece, very much like the realism of Courbet, is like who's the subject matter? It almost feels like the center of the painting, you know, if we were going to look at it like a target, is empty. And so the subjects are cramped over into a corner. And then here's this other gentleman kind of off to the side. So, you know, this is really interesting kinds of compositions. He stayed in Italy for about 5 years and studied Italian art, especially Renaissance works. He returns to Paris in 1859, and he paints portraits of his family and friends and a number of historical subjects. And in Paris, Degas comes to know Manet in the late 1860s, and he turns towards contemporary themes, including theatrical scenes and portraits, with strong emphasis on social and intellectual implications of different kinds of props and settings. Hence this idea of, you know, the horses and, you know, these sort of finer things in life, you know, the polo game that's going on, it looks like in the background. You know, this wide open sky, beautiful. And that starts to change after he meets the Impressionists. When we talk about theater and we talk about Degas, we have to talk about ballet. So here in the early 70s, the female ballet dancers become his favorite theme. He sketched from a live model in his studio and combined these poses into groupings that depicted rehearsals and performance scenes in which dancers on stage entered the stage and resting or waiting to perform are shown simultaneously and in counterpoint, often at unusual angles of vision. So in this one, it's like he's looking down. She's, you know, her tutu is like sort of flying out under the chair that she's sitting on, and her back is, you know, stretched out as she's trying to tie up her toe shoes. Here's a wonderful piece called The Dance Class. And I always think about, you know, there's a couple of these. The thing that's interesting to me is this little water can that is down in the corner. I know, but it's in there. He puts his name, and it's almost like a joke, like he's talking about, like, this is about as much, you know, limberness as I have. But also look at the spout of the can and how it almost would resemble like the girls exercising and working on a particular dance move. Again, it looks like he's probably seated somewhere like above them slightly, maybe on a stage, you know, looking down. Here's another rehearsal. And then we've got the light of the stage, kind of the stark light of the faces. Again, we're not really looking at anybody in particular. Here's another, the rehearsal. Very quick movement. He also used oil sticks quite a bit. Later on, and we see that in that very first painting of the ballet dancer. So the characters in this picture are really interesting. This is Degas' sort of alternate portraiture. It's a glimpse in a Parisian cafe. I mean, this piece is, to me, is really just truly beautiful. I mean, just the look of the color, the way that the sort of tones of the face and kind of, you know, expression of the two characters. The woman is an actress. Her name is Ellen Andre, and the man is Marcellin de Botton. He's a painter and engraver, and a kind of celebrity at the time, a bohemian character. The cafe where they are taking their refreshment is the Café de la Nouvelle Athenis. De Botton is a popular figure. He seems to have led the move of those concerned with the arts from the previous rendezvous at the Café Gorbeau to the Nouvelle Athens. It's frequented by Manet and Degas, and some critics and literary people, as well as painters, were interested observers from sort of across the scene of this young, of this painting. The painting shows Degas' favorite device of placing the figures off-center and with a large intervening area of space in the foreground. So that's really kind of interesting piece that he does. A forceful and original composition results from the mode of arrangement and the dark but harmoniously related tones of color and shadow, especially the shadows on the back wall. They're really interesting and beautiful. Degas evidently retained a memory and moment when his sitters were in a pensive mode. He did not seek to flatter them or make them look pretty, which I think is also interesting, an idea that he regarded with absolute disdain. Like, I wouldn't, you need to paint them as they are, not to make them look more attractive. On the other hand, nothing could have been further from his thoughts than to depict these familiar acquaintances as monsters of dissipation and degradation, as a moral lesson. That was not what he was doing. It might be observed, incidentally, that they were drinking nothing stronger than black coffee. In England, however, the persons represented were considered to be shockingly degraded by an involved piece of reasoning in the picture itself, as regarded as a blow to morality. So the Victorians looked at this and they thought, oh, this is really awful. And, that she's, first of all, sitting in a bar and sitting with this bohemian and so forth. But again, it looks like she has that green liquid in front of her. And of course, that would be the very addictive alcoholic beverage called absinthe. Another favorite theme was racehorses and jockeys. Even more than dancers, they occupied his long career as an artist. There were 91 works in this category that were cataloged between 1860 and 1900, and a number that did not include Degas' equestrian waxes and bronzes, because later on he decides to start doing sculptures, and so he does these waxes, and then some of them he pours into bronzes, some he has not. So there's quite a few waxes that were discovered in his studio after his death. So here again, what is the scene? Well, there we have them off to the side again, not a whole lot of foreground, but somewhat a bit of foreground, and it's almost like as if the horse is greeting the other jockey, right? So he kind of gives the horse sort of a... and again, this is done with pastel. It's done very lightly and sometimes even tentatively. He varies the degree of pressure on the painting. These are oil pastels, not chalk pastels. It is much more active in describing the closely hatched wisping grass. So you can see how he can use that pastel because it's hardened to move it back and forth really quickly to create shapes. He builds up the forms with strokes of orange and red and black and gray and white on the horses. There's traces of green that spills over from the surrounding grass literally onto the horse. So you can see sort of in the back hindquarters of the horses using that green. And the serenity of the group is, really interesting with the rearing horse kind of in the background. So these horses in the foreground are pretty calm. The distant church tower with its attendant cluster of buildings and pathways cutting across the hills, traced in white, and create a sort of no man's land, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Really quite beautiful. Another artist that we want to look at is the daughter of an affluent Pittsburgh businessman whose French ancestry had endowed him with a passion for that country. She studied art in Pennsylvania at the Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and then traveled extensively to Europe, finally settling in Paris in 1874. In that year, she had a work that was accepted at the Salon, and in 1877, she made the acquaintance of Degas, whom she became a long-term friend with. His art and ideas had a considerable influence on her own work. He introduced her to the Impressionists, and she participated in their exhibitions starting in 1879, 1880, 1881, and 1886. And when Degas had decided he did not want to join one of the exhibitions in 1882, she also did not. Even though her family objected to her becoming a professional artist, Cassatt studied art in Philadelphia at the early age of 15. And then part of her parents' concern was that Cassatt would be exposed to feminist ideas and bohemian behavior. So this kind of move away from the idea of chivalry and how women should be thought of. So we, especially we talked about that a little bit with Juliet Margaret Cameron and her sort of idealization of how women should be thought of. And so her parents were very afraid of that. Only 20% of the students at Philadelphia were female. Most viewed art as kind of a skill that they would use in social situations, not necessarily to become professional painters. She continues her studies during the wars of the American Civil War. With her fellow students, she actually studied with Thomas Eakins, which if this were a full-on painting art history course, we would definitely take a look at his work, but we aren't going to be looking at him. Definitely someone you might want to look up. Cassatt often created images of social and private lives of women, with particular emphasis on the intimate bonds between mothers and children. This is a painting from the balcony, so let's take a look at some of those. So here we have the little girl in the blue chair, 1878. We really see a difference between this 1870, early 1870s painting, and then when we see these later paintings after she's exposed to the Impressionists. And she starts to paint faster and much more fluidly. And there we have this little girl just sort of lounging on the blue chair. And then this is an awesome painting. Think about perspective here. Just look at the perspective of the viewer. So when we look at paintings, one of the things that's always interesting to me is that the way that we look at the painting changes depending on where the viewer decides to place you. Not necessarily the people in the painting or the characters in the painting, but where the viewer is placed. So you are literally standing up where these people are on the floor, right? So it gives you sort of a, like you are looking down upon them, and they're in a more submissive or vulnerable approach. And they are vulnerable. They're women and children. So they're in this kind of vulnerable position that she places. Again, look at the quick movements on the picture for the water, the definition of the flower, the definition of the carpeting, and then she moves, and even the furniture in the background, very lightly defined, but where does she take time is in the facial expressions, the face of the mother and child. Here's another mother and child with a green background, 1897. This is a pastel. You can see the quick movements, the linear fashion of the oil pastel, crayon type drawing, and she comes back in and really works up into the hair. Look at the definition on the coat, overcoat or robe that the woman is wearing in the home. And then, there's this we're not looking at the viewer. They're not looking at us. They're kind of looking away, like they're contemplating something, like maybe someone's leaving the house or something on that order. And then, of course, we have the mirror in the background. So that was always a fun thing for the Impressionists. They like to bring in the mirrors. Another Impressionist painter we're going to look at is Berthe Morisot. Born in a family of wealth and culture, Morisot received the conventional lessons of drawing and painting. When she was young, she went firmly against convention, however, in choosing to take these pursuits seriously and make them her life's work. Having studied for a time under Camille Corot, she later began her long friendship with Manet, who became her brother-in-law in 1874. So we're talking about Edouard Manet, and was the most important single influence on the development of her style. Unlike most of the other Impressionists who were then intensively engaged in optical experiments with light and color, Morisot and Manet agreed on a more conservative approach, confining their use of color to natural color, or what we would call local color. Morisot, however, did encourage Manet to adopt Impressionist high-key palette, to abandon the use of black, which that's definitely something, if you look at these Impressionist paintings, you're really not going to see much black. Her own carefully composed, brightly hued canvases are often studies of women, either out of doors or in domestic settings. Morisot and the American artist Mary Cassatt are generally considered the most important women painters of the late 19th century. Here's a painting of her sister sitting in a window. She was, for the most part, Morisot was undervalued for over a century, possibly because she was a woman. She's now considered among the first league of Impressionist painters. In 1864, she exhibited for the first time at the Salon de Paris, sponsored by the government and judged by the scholars and the Academy. The Salon was the official annual exhibition of the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Her work was selected for exhibition in 6 subsequent salons, until in 1874 she joined the rejected Impressionists in the first exhibit of their own in the Salon des Refusés, which included Paul Cézanne, Edgar Degas, Claude Monet, Morisot, Camille Pissarro, Pierre Renoir, Alfred Sisley. It was held, as we had said earlier, in the studio of the photographer, and the photographer was Nadar. Both she and her sister Edma Morisot chose to become painters. Once Berthe settled in pursuing art, her family did not impede her career. So here we have the cradle. Again, this idea of women and children. She became the sister-in-law of her friend and colleague Edouard Manet when she married his brother Eugene. In 1868, Morisot became acquainted with him. He took special interest in her, and he did several warm portrayals of her in paintings, including a striking portrait of Morisot in a black veil while in mourning for her after her father's death. And this is one of those paintings. Here's a marine painting 1869. It was Manet who gave her her first easel as a Christmas present. He also, took a look at what submission she was going to take to the salon, and Manet mistook one of Morisot's self-criticisms as an invitation to add his corrections, which he did, and Morisot was not really very happy because he actually went in and repainted a little bit on one of her paintings. An oil painting of a young mother. Here's what was written about this painting. An oil painting of a young mother playing hide and seek behind a cherry tree with her little girl is a work that is perfect in the emotion of its observation, the freshness of its palette, and its complete composition of its background. And this is 1874. He says, Berthe Morisot has wit to the tips of her fingers, especially at her fingertips. What fine artistic feeling! You cannot find more graceful images handled more deliberately and delicately. I would add that here the execution is a complete accord with the idea that was trying to be expressed. So those were two reviews of this particular painting, Cachet, Cachet. And I just love the simpleness of the marks here. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about the Impressionists is that we actually have more Impressionist paintings in the United States than they do in Paris and in France. And the reason for that was because many of these paintings were not very expensive. They didn't have a big market. They weren't really accepted by the French Academy. And so nouveau riche that were going on the Grand Trine would go to Paris. They'd see the paintings, they'd buy them, bring them back. And then when they passed away, many of them were given to museums here. So you can find some beautiful Impressionist paintings here at the Milwaukee Art Museum, as well as at the Chicago Art Institute. There's a whole area. So definitely you should go there. And here is the last one by Morisot, In the Park, 1874. Again, we've got these quick movements and ways to define what the tree looks like, the expressions on the faces, just very quick marketing. And that'll take us to the end of the Impressionist period.